Welcome to this video on the format and language of a literature review. It's the third in our literature review series. In this video, I want to look at the common formats or genres, you might call them outlines or structures of literature reviews, and what language is typically used. In the previous videos, we looked at the purpose of a literature review and organizing for a literature review. So here's a common format in the table that I'll show you in a minute for a literature review. There may be some deviations depending on your discipline. For example, in some disciplines, the literature review is not a separate section or chapter. But this is what generally a literature review looks like. These are the components that need to go in it. Depending on your discipline, the components may change. So in the introduction, you would usually state the aim of the review, establish why the subject is interesting or relevant, state the scale or scope of the review, describe what's included or excluded. You might contain definitions in there, explain the organization of the review, and usually the introduction contains some signposting for the reader. That's the metatext or meta-discourse, and this is where you explain to the reader what's going to happen in the review. Within the body, this is where you would organize the literature, the material, your source documents. And you may do this in a number of ways, and in the rest of the video we'll discuss further ways. But for example, you may look at the methodological frameworks, the conceptual evolution as concepts change over time. You might group the literature into themes and discuss debates within the themes, and you might link the themes together at the end of this section. Then you would have a conclusion which relates back to the purpose and the aims and the objectives. And you would really draw conclusions based on your analysis of the literature. The page numbers are completely arbitrary. They're just to show the weighting because the page numbers depend on your project. So let's look at some organizational structures for the body of the literature review. You can group together journal articles or chapters according to concepts or definitions. So while some researchers focus on writing that avoids plagiarism, others argue that patch writing is a developmental form of writing. So there are two opposing views in the literature, and I could group all the literature that agrees with one and all the literature that agrees with the other. Organize the literature chronologically according to publication date, a very useful way to see how concepts have evolved. You can organize the literature according to the context, the country or region where the research took place, so that you can see the differences in these different geographical groupings. You could group the literature according to discipline or sub-discipline of the author, so look at school education versus adult education, and you can use these to show similarities and contrasts. And you can say something about the literature through those groupings. You could group studies according to the writer's perspective or conceptual framework. You could group them according to those you agree with and who support your argument, and those you disagree with and would provide a counter to your argument. For example, modernist conceptions of research say this, postmodernists by contrast say that. Is the methodology important to your research? If so, group studies with similar methods. Qualitative studies show this, while statistical representations show that. Perhaps implications for practice is important. You could group studies according to what might be most useful in practice. Those that advocate explicit pedagogy suggest 3 routes, 1, 2, 3. So all the time what you're trying to do is group things to make sense for your reader of the literature. Unpack a concept or theory or theme systematically. Take your key concept and logically and systematically examine it through the literature. Before 1945, for example, there was no concept of poverty as we know it now. Current conceptualizations of poverty have 3 components, 1, 2, 3. You could use a problem solution format, so use examples from the literature to pose a problem, and then the solutions that have been identified through studies. You could use an argument and counter-argument structure. If you know the Toolman structure, and we have a video on that, that's a really good structure to use in a literature review. Think about how to develop an entry point for your argument through the literature. Provide a summary of previous arguments. in the literature that are counter to yours, describe relationships between previous studies, write about limitations, problematic interpretations, inadequate approaches, and so on. Defend your perspective, whether it's your theory or your methodology, by showing what has been done in the research and drawing on evidence from the literature. Now, there may be many other organizing schemes particularly relevant to your field, but the main point I'm trying to make, and I'm trying to give you ideas for, is that organizing is part of analyzing, breaking things apart and examining the parts. Then you synthesize by pulling the parts back together again, but with insight. So this is what you're doing in the literature review. You're organizing it so that you can make sense of it for your reader. Now we come to writing the literature review, and it would be really useful to write a problem purpose statement and to identify a key research question. What is the key problem in this literature that I want to explore? What is the purpose of this literature review? What is the key question I want to answer? What concepts do I need to explain? What will I include, exclude, and what's the scope of this literature review? And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about the problem purpose statement, we have a video series on that, and you can have a look at that. Decide on a reading strategy. So how are you going to search? What keywords are you going to search? How will you evaluate sources? Then read, take notes, summarize, free write. Organize your notes and free writes into organic maps or tables, and we have a whole video in this series on that. Think about your arguments in this review. Current research has underestimated theory or method X, misunderstood theory or method Y, not unpacked assumptions inherent in concept Z. Write your argument in one sentence. I want to argue that. This is just for yourself so that your thoughts are clear when you write. Write out a structure or a plan or an outline, and you may want to use some of the organizing structures outlined in this video. You might even want to use several. So for example, you would begin with a chronological account and then move into a thematic organization. In your planning, think about how you'll move from description to analysis, which is essentially summary to analysis. So you might provide short summaries of the research studies, of your readings in one paragraph, and then explain the significance of these studies in another. Perhaps you want to write about the studies that argue against your perspective, and then the studies that agree with your perspective, so that the reader ends with your perspective. We have videos on writing from description to analysis and a whole series on critical reading and using sources, so please watch those. You might use a compare and contrast structure, for example, pros of A, cons of A, pros of B, cons of B, pros of AB, and then cons of AB, point by point, A and B in terms of themes, or however you decide it. Think about how you'll introduce definitions or concepts. Academic definitions don't come from dictionaries. Usually meaning is contested, and you want to show the range of meanings. So for example, there are 4 different conceptualizations of poverty: the World Bank one, a political economy perspective, a humanist perspective, and a post-developmental perspective. You could then discuss each of these in turn and explain to your reader which one you align yourself with, and which you are in opposition to. So, and use numbering 1, 2, 3, 4, because that helps with the grouping, and it's useful to help your reader understand how you've organized your literature review. You might also need to write about processes, and this would be step-by-step sequencing of something. You might want to talk about relationships in the literature, how studies are connected or not connected. Perhaps there are silences in how they are not connected. Once you have your notes from reading, then outline a plan for writing the literature review, and then write a draft. Now, many people get stuck when they write the literature review. So one of the ways to keep writing is to write bad drafts. Give yourself permission to write bad drafts. So write focusing on the argument and the purpose of the chapter, and leave gaps and notes to yourself. Fill in this study, fill in that study, maybe rethink this section. You don't have to show anyone your messy drafts until you fix them up, but allow yourself to just put in bits and pieces and then gradually build it up into something coherent. If you get stuck at any point, break it up into the smallest section that you can work on, even if it's just one paper that you summarize and then analyze, and then add another paper. Try free writing a section just from memory of what you've read, then go back to your notes, check accuracy, and add in sources. Once you have a draft written, go section by section and revise each section. Now let's look at the language in literature reviews, and here I want to focus on transition words and phrases, which really are extremely helpful because they show your reader how you are moving from one thought to the next. So words like first, second, following this, Jones suggests X, however Brown argues. And you can see that these transition words can actually help you to structure your literature review. So words that carry the purpose through, the main purpose and another purpose. Words that imply a structure over the past 2 decades, in the first decade, in the second decade. Similar opinions, similarly, likewise, in the same way. Alternative, others argue that. Alternatively, it could be argued. Rebuttal words, however, on the other hand, nonetheless. Contrast, contradict, although, conversely, by contrast. Results and consequence, as a result, because of this. Concluding words, therefore, in conclusion, we can see that. So what I'm hoping that you can see from this is that these words help with the structure of your literature review. They help to shape how the reader moves through that literature review. Academic writing usually contains hedging. We never say never and are more likely to say rarely, not always, but often. Instead of all, we might say most. And we use, in our literature review in particular, we reveal our perspective and stance. And stance is revealed through hedging, as I've said, possibly perhaps appear to agree, these modalities instead of being certain. And boosters, so words that strengthen the claim. When we say this is a crucial point or an important point, we're revealing our stance. Attitude markers, Jones correctly argues, or as Jones importantly says, there we are highlighting that we agree with that particular author. And of course, personal pronouns. I suggest this, or I agree with Jones. Use metatext or these signposts to help with the flow of writing, to show changes in your thinking, and to indicate when you're moving on to a different point. So to show that there's one point that contrasts with another, you need to have these signposts and metatexts. Part 1 of this review attempts to draw together X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z will be discussed in the next section. The next section examines. This metatext allows your reader to follow easily without having to work hard. Conclusions are really important in a literature review. Conclusions to the sections as well as to the overall conclusion. At the end of a thematic section, pull together for your reader what this all means. Don't expect the reader to understand what you're thinking. Pay attention to referencing. Referencing provides the reader with the evidence that will convince the reader of your claims in the literature review. The more you pay attention to the details, the more you will increase your reader's confidence in what you have to say. Be careful not to plagiarize, and we have a whole video series on avoiding plagiarism and using sources in writing. If you are still finding it hard to get your head around the literature review, you're definitely not alone, but think of a courtroom where lawyers call on expert witnesses to provide support for their arguments. They also refute the counter evidence. The judge, who is the reader in our case, has to decide which lawyer has presented the most convincing case. It's just a metaphor to help you get your head around literature reviews. So a reader is going to evaluate your literature review on whether or not the review contains known authorities in the field and whether you've covered rigorous academic research. Is the research published in well-known journals or books by well-known authors? Are these texts peer-reviewed? How recent are the references? Is the research current? Does the writer show multiple perspectives, or does the research selected show a one-sided point of view? Are the debates highlighted? Has the relevant research been covered? Is it relevant to the writer's argument? Is the selection of sources consistent with the purpose of the research? Are sources worthy? Are the sources selected worthy as evidence? Now, obviously, if you're studying something historical, your sources won't be current, but it will be relevant to your topic. A good book to read on literature reviews is Doing a Literature Review in Health and Social Care. Although it's a book on the health sciences, it really is applicable to many disciplines and covers both qualitative and quantitative research. There are lots of books out there on literature reviews, and really reading any of them will help you, but this one is particularly good. Key points from this video: literature reviews consist of, at its most basic level, an introduction, body and conclusion, and in the conclusion you pull together your argument in this literature review. There are lots of organizational structures for the body, but here are some ideas. Use themes, discuss a conceptual evolution, look at the chronology of a concept, geographic contextual ideas, and use that as an organizing framework. A disciplinary or subdisciplinary focus, a writer's perspective, show the debates, look at the methodologies, group things according to implications for practice. Other structures might be to unpack a concept systematically, a problem-solution format, arguments and counter-arguments, and there may be other organizing schemes relevant to your discipline. It might be useful to write a problem-purpose statement and to even identify a key question. Decide on a reading strategy and think about your argument while you're reading. Transitional phrases and words are really critical for your reader to understand how you've organized things, how you've grouped them, and how you're moving through the review. Write drafts, write bad drafts, and fix them up. Begin with small sections and build the bits and pieces together. You may want to pause the video to look at the references in more detail. Thank you for watching this video on how to write and the language and formatting of a literature review. Please be sure to watch the other videos in this series because we cover a whole lot of issues, and best of luck with your literature review.